Media Club, and today I proposed the new book from Antonio Lopez. He's a faculty member at the John Cabot University in Italy, and he's also the chair of the communications department in Italy and at John Cabot University. And he brought out a new book last fall, December, I believe.
December.
December, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's about greening media literacy. It's not the first time he's writing about it, I found out, but I read it like the first time, so it hit me on the head. And I maybe with my background coming from Munich in Germany, and I grew up also in the green movement. It hit me on the head, like the aspect of ecology and the importance of ecology. Also, the fact that I have a little bit of background in sociology, and the ecological question is a big topic, of course, in sociology. So again, the topic really interested me. And so I said to myself, why not listen to Antonio? He has been writing about it, I think, at least for 8, 10 years right now. And so I invited him to come along, and I'm very happy to have him along to speak and to answer questions. Um, in general, maybe about today, I think, Antonio, we appreciate people speaking up, right? Asking questions. We're looking for the dialogue. And then maybe, Antonio, do you want to start first with the prompt, or do you want to maybe start first with the concept of the equal media literacy concept,
Wow.
or
So Michael and I met last week to just think about how to approach this workshop or discussion. And we came up with some ideas, but since we spoke, it occurred to me that basically, uh, whenever I approach this topic with a group, I'm always a little bit uh, nervous. I don't know if nervous is the right word, but I don't know what level of knowledge people have, because I thought maybe I'll tell you a little bit about how I arrived to this point, and then maybe I would just like to gauge from all of you how much of you would like a little bit of an overview and introduction, or how much of you want to just get into a discussion. I'm more into having a discussion, but I also understand that a lot of people don't really understand the relationship between media and the environment, and it usually requires a little bit of an introduction. So what I thought was I would explain a little bit how I arrived to this point, and then I can ask the group. Okay, I already see people want a little bit of an introduction. Okay, um, va bene. I will. I will do that. But let me just for a second talk a little bit about my background, just so you know how I got here. So one thing I like to tell my students is that I got my PhD in the School of Punk Rock, because when I was a teenager, I was really in the punk scene in LA in the 1980s. And part of being in the punk scene was also being very active in the anti-nuclear movement, which was huge in the 1980s. If you are in my generation, you remember that there was giant marches to try to stop the Cold War and the proliferation of missiles. Was everyone had this fear that we could be annihilated at any minute from nuclear war. I used to have these nightmares of nuclear war. And it was just part of life, which I think a lot of people don't appreciate who didn't grow up in that environment. And on top of that, I had a kind of an unusual background because my parents were divorced. My dad was in New Mexico, my mom was in Los Angeles. And I went back and forth and sort of between the big, sort of massive urban environment. And in the 70s, when I was a kid, there was a lot of pollution. You know, my eyes used to burn from the smog. And then I go to New Mexico, excuse me, which was very beautiful and pristine and not very populated. And I would have this contrast in these two different experiences. So I always maintain that sort of dual path of being interested and caring about environmental issues, but also being very involved in like do-it-yourself media production that was part of the punk movement. So um, I eventually, after university, ended up in New Mexico, living full time, and part of being in New Mexico meant that I uh, was heavily involved with a lot of the politics and the culture there, and inevitably, and I worked a lot with Native Americans. So uh, I was working as a journalist throughout the 20s, and in 1933, I'm not that old. Uh, when I turned 33, uh, back in 1933, um, no, I had been a journalist in the 19 Jesus in, my, in the 1920s. Yeah, when I was in my 20s, and so that I was primarily working in the media, and then in 19 when I turned 33, I had a health crisis. My immune system collapsed, and I still have a lot of health issues. That's why I'm always stuffed up and blowing my nose. And it's probably because of some environmental stuff, but I really don't know ultimately the source. So I had to stop working because I was so sick I couldn't work. And I went on, I did a pilgrimage to Spain. I did the Camino to Santiago de Compostela, which some of you may have heard of. So for 2 months, I walked across Spain and kind of figured, I realized that probably what my real passion would be is teaching, because all my grandparents were teachers, and I decided that I had to change my life and become a teacher. So I came back to Santa Fe. But when I started to look at what it meant to be a teacher, and I looked at all the certification, my sort of inner punk rocker kind of jumped out. It's like, I can't do this. I can't take tests and do all that kind of, I have to get my hands on the media and do stuff with the kids. I can't go through this whole process. And so I started working at a local teen center doing uh, do it yourself media. And I ended up through that at the Santa Fe Indian School, where I taught writing and then video. And then through that, I was doing almost all my work with Native American communities, and almost everything we did was related to environmental issues, which brings me to the current point, which is at that time that I was teaching in Santa Fe Indian School, and I was also becoming part of the media literacy movement. This was 20 years ago. And I was sort of, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the New Mexico Media Literacy Project, but they're the people that trained me. And that's how I got into all this. And they were sort of the critical wing of media literacy versus the more mainstream or sort of conventional wing. So I'll wrap up quickly so we can have a discussion. Uh, what I found was when I was working in Native American communities that the epistemologically, the experience of that was so different than what I was getting out of the media literacy movement. I also started to get my master's at the New School in media studies, so I was sort of really getting immersed in all this European Anglo theory, but it was really absent of sort of a native perspective, but also a green perspective. And the more I got into environmental issues, the more I was like, well, where is it? How come no one in the media literacy movement and no one in media studies is dealing with this issue? Because I really cared about it. So I started to research it. Got into a PhD program at Prescott College in education for sustainability. And that was my dissertation project, was to find out what were the barriers and opportunities and why these things are not connected. So that's what I spent the last 12 years doing, and that's how I arrived to this point. So I think people are asking, how are these issues related? So I think I will do that for 5 minutes, and then I want to have a discussion, because I'm not going to be. You guys are all experts, and I don't really want to be talking at you this whole time. Is there any chance you guys could put me on to? Can I share a screen?
Yeah, you should be able. I think
Okay, let me try.
on the bottom
Yeah,
of this.
okay, it's giving me the option.
Okay, and I'm gonna jump in, Antonio, in 5 minutes
Uh, okay, thank you. I'm
because
just going to go really fast.
please everybody prepare your questions for Antonio, or
Okay, do
like
you see my
reactions in
book?
general.
And you guys see the slideshow?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so ecomedia is a term that's been emerging over the past 10 years, which is it just a turn of phrase so that we acknowledge that media are materially embedded in the earth and are also about the environment. I'll explain that in a minute. And so eco-media literacy just combines the sort of aspects of critical media literacy with, critical media literacy techniques with the analytical tools of eco-media study. So I'm sort of merging these two things together. And if you do this type of analysis, you can analyze representational text, a platform, a gadget, or a hyperobject, which could be like the internet or an economic system. And the method I developed, which I talk more about in the book, is to do a holistic kind of analysis where whatever media object you're looking at, which whether it could be an advertisement, a book, a film, a gadget, newspaper, news, or climate news, which is something I'm interested in, you look at it from the point of view of culture, political ecology, life world, and then eco-materialism. And the reason I do that is because what I've noticed is that if you use this iceberg model of systems thinking, the idea is that the reason why we don't tend to solve environmental problems is because we focus always on the event. So the event would be a hurricane or a flood or a fire, and we sort of put out the fire and we rebuild, but we don't address the underlying patterns or look at the trends over time of why these things keep happening. And then what below the trend and the pattern is the systemic structures that put the system in place that are the cause of these repeated disasters. And then at the very bottom is your mental model, or the term I'm starting to use is a knowledge system, which is at the root of how we build our societal structures. So what I've noticed that in media literacy, we tend to focus on the event, which is the text, that we look at the output of the whole system. And then, sometimes, good media literacy educators get below that with looking over patterns over time. You can look at patterns of gender representations or racial stereotypes, things like that. And then at a deeper level, sometimes we even get into the political economy, which is the structure of how media are produced. But then we rarely even look at what is the mental model, what is the epistemology, what is the worldview that produced that economic system. So the method I have developed is designed to go to the deepest level. So how are the media and environment related? Well, there's many different ways. I'll just give you the brief summary and then I'll be finished. First is minerals. Minerals have to be extracted from the earth for our phones. It can be gold, coltan, all the different things that make the circuits work, to make our phones vibrate, to boost our antenna strength, strengthen our antenna signals. These minerals predominantly come from conflict zones like in the Congo, and they are quite often with their mind are very destructive to local ecosystems and also to people, that the people are exploited and they produce quite a bit of violence. So we need those minerals for all of our gadgets. And then we have this great book by Jack Chu, which I really recommend, Goodbye Ice Slave, which is about the very exploitive labor conditions in which our phones, gadgets, and computers are all produced. And what that does to the local ecologies. We use a lot of chemicals and alloys and various different processes to make our gadgets. We have the problem of e-waste. Where does that stuff go? And then also, actually, probably the biggest environmental impact is the server farms. The whole cloud, which is a misnomer, the cloud that serves our data lives on actual computers that require electricity. And most of that electricity is produced by carbon fuel. So the global output of data is producing as much CO2 as the airline industry, and it's doubling every 10 years. So that's a huge contribution to the climate. So that's, by the way, what I call the ecological footprint. And then we have the ecological mind print, which is the way that media sort of frame how we discuss issues. For example, as all of you, a lot of you know, in the United States, for many years, people didn't believe climate change was real. That's because the fossil fuel industry was very good at gaming the media system and making sure that their ideas and beliefs dominated and that their discourses were the ones that were accepted. They confused people about the science and created doubt. They used for tobacco, which is an issue that media literacy was involved with for quite a while. Then there's the promotion of consumerism, which and the idea of endless growth, which is also at the core of most media. And then finally, how that impacts our sense of place, space, and time. So I will stop there. And at this point, I would like to open it up to questions or even ask a question to you, which is, how do you feel about the relationship between media literacy and the environment? Does that theme resonate with you? Is it something you feel like is important to address? Um, I open it up. So, any thoughts, any comments?
Mm,
Davina has a
Um,
question.
oh,
Um,
Hello, I'm sorry my video is off. It's just really after a really long day in India, really long Monday. So, Dr. Lopez, thank you so much for the introductory slides. I think it really helped a lot of us who might not have been able to read the chapter, but I did look at the video. So that was great. A couple of days ago, I shared on my Facebook, I was trying to look for that article, but I couldn't find it in time, um, where people expressed a lot of surprise that you should turn off your videos when you're using a video conferencing software or a Zoom or a Google Meet. And that directly connects with the carbon footprint you're generating. Um, so I think going off from there, where we clearly have a lack of awareness about how our mass media or even day-to-day everyday life media artifacts have a large carbon footprint. If you could just talk about that a little more, please.
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
A couple of days ago on Facebook, I shared an article
Yeah,
about
I got
how it's
that.
a good idea to turn off your videos when you're doing Zoom or Google Meet. And we kind of don't really have a handle on how much our everyday media use has a carbon footprint. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, especially in
Yeah,
the pandemic related work that we
yeah.
have, work from
So
home or study from.
yeah, thank you. So yeah, it's true. Streaming has a big impact. So some of the biggest impacts on servers right now are streaming, uh, especially like YouTube. But actually, you'd be surprised. Cryptocurrencies are actually have the biggest impact on the environment in terms of power usage. The cryptocurrencies are using more power than some countries, and also AI development, because artificial development to develop facial recognition and voice recognition, they have to run thousands of computers at a very high rate. So yes, it's true that our video streaming has an impact, but I will I want to avoid the framing of the problem as being necessarily our fault or our responsibility. Yes, all of us to an extent need to do something about this, and as I am encouraging through my own work, but we also have to put the burden on the companies to source energy that is clean. So Google is working on that. Apple's working on that. So there are efforts on the way with the big companies. I think that whether we stream video on, like for example, this little conference or not, is not going to make a huge difference. It does add a little bit, but what's going to make a difference is policy changes and getting governments to force companies to use clean energy. That's really where we should focus our energy. That's, I think, the most important thing. And there is a little bit of a issue, I think, in media literacy about to what extent, as media literacy educators, is it responsible to talk about policy? Because I know that there's a branch of media literacy that don't want to touch policy because it's too political. And I know that maybe in schools you can't talk about that, but I really feel like we have to get back to this discussion about trying to change the laws and the rules, the way that media companies are behaving is also tech companies. So I would encourage us to sort of have both approaches. Arcana, you have your hand up?
I think as well, right? Frank had his hand up as well.
Or
Okay.
Fawn? Someone? Okay, Frank?
Sure. So I think the issue of media literacy being somewhat taboo in certain areas of discussion in schools is a big issue in media literacy in general. And I think that, to me, the environment being part of the discussion and understanding when we're using media is obvious to me. What was not obvious to me until it was kind of like a bell went off when I listened to you on the video interview, and when I looked at your book a little, was how much energy we use for our modern media. I think that's what really caught my attention, and I think it's important that we start educating each other about that. So that's where I jumped on anyway.
Yeah, so I think we should be energy literate. I mean, I think the whole thing that happened in Texas the past few weeks was a big wake up call that people don't really pay attention to think about energy grids. But look what happened when people were ignoring the importance of that. So I think all of us should learn about our energy system. And there's a great book called People's Power, which is about the history of energy in the United States. And I highly, highly recommend this book. Fawn?
I was writing down that book. What I thought was really interesting in the introduction was the comment about a paradigm shift that was necessary. And I think that goes to that very bottom of the iceberg, a shift in worldview, or first is, I guess, awareness of which worldview you're operating from, or some of these issues are operating from, and then a shift or a paradigm shift in those worldviews. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, or if anybody else wanted to jump in, if it has to do with Indigenous perspectives, and it seems like it did quite a bit in the introduction.
Well, yeah, it's definitely related. I mean, I really go into this in the book. I have a whole chapter about this. what we've inherited is a worldview from modernity, which values certain ideas around science and progress, and which is very anthropocentric. And so there was a shift in order for the Industrial Revolution to take off and for modernity to really take hold. There had to be a shift in our belief system where the earth became not something that had intrinsic value, but became instrumental, that we could just use the earth and animals. But this also, by the way, relates to the treatment of people. And when the categories of nature were created, where nature is separate from humans, it was also where categories of humans, Black people, brown people, had to be separated from white civilization so that they could also be exploited. So the same paradigm that took over to exploit nature was the same paradigm that took over to exploit human beings, because it was the same system, the same mentality, and women as well. So, there's a great historian, Caroline Merchant, who talks about that the scientific revolution, one of the things it had to do was to wipe out women's knowledge in Europe. And that's why you had all the witch trials. And you had to destroy a whole knowledge system so that science could take over. And if you look at the early scientists like Newton and Descartes and slipping my mind into the book, they talk about nature as a woman that has to be tortured. It has to be put on a rack. It has to be extracted. So it's the same mentality: patriarchy, racism, abuse of the environment. So those are all related. So what I talk about is sort of an anthropocentric worldview versus an ecocentric worldview, and then there's many worldviews sort of somewhere in the middle. So the paradigm shift would be to a more ecocentric knowledge system, and the primary core belief of that is that that nature or the environment has to be respected as having its own intrinsic value, which is hard for Westerners to accept. It's not. This is the issue that I have when I work with Native Americans. They say, "Oh, don't point the camera over there because it's not allowed. It's or you can't film this thing because these are sacred and you cannot film them. It's not accepted." And as a Westerner, it doesn't make any sense to me. But my Native American employers, the people who are putting me, have me out in the field working with the kids, are telling me this is sacred. Don't touch it. You can't do that. You have to respect this for what it is. You have to, so it's a different hierarchy, if you want to call it that. By the way, I know people are putting stuff in the chat, and hard for me to talk and read at the same time.
Don't worry, Antonio. I'm trying to catch up a little bit. Otherwise, yeah. Akana, I think she had a question as well. So please feel free.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I am not switching on my video for the same reason as Devina. And I just wanted to raise this question that this issue of eco-media literacy is much pervasive and government is also a part of it. Here in India, we see that there is a whole thirst upon paperless universities, paperless offices. And the rationale behind it is that we are actually saving our environment by by adopting more and more technologies, by being paperless. During COVID time, we have seen that there is a huge fund given to the universities and colleges for new technologies to take up and to make it completely paperless work. Okay, so I am little wondered that what is real scenario behind it? Are we really saving environment by going digital and by being paperless everywhere? So that is what my concern is. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we have to dispel the myth that the knowledge economy is deindustrialized economy. It's not true. The knowledge economy is a more industrialized economy. And that's why that Jack Chu book I'll show you, the I Slave book, he makes this point vociferously. He says that this technology, this online work is more industrialization. It's not deindustrialization. It's not dematerialization. So we have to retrain how we think about these issues. And I think one of the reasons why media people have ignored the environment is that there's a bias in our culture that ideas are immaterial, that representations are thoughts and they're just in the air. They don't actually exist in a material reality. So we really have to, the first step is to ground ourselves in the materiality of all these media technologies. Now, if you go online, you can find some articles like, is a Kindle more environmentally friendly than a book? I find these articles a bit misleading because they compare one book and one Kindle. But if I can put 100 books on a Kindle, that's probably less damaging to the environment than printing 100 books. But the Kindle is also environmentally destructive. I think what we have to do, and I think you raise a very good, important point, is we have to problematize this idea that more technology is better for the environment. We have to, but at the same time, we need to argue for green IT, technology that's good for the environment. So we can't just dismiss it altogether, because that's part of the reason, one of the reasons why people hate environmentalists is they think that environmentalists are anti-progress, or the environmentalists don't believe in technology. I would consider myself a neo-Luddite, but I also, all I mean by that is I think technology needs to be humanized, not dehumanizing. It needs to be ecologically appropriate. We don't have to use petroleums. We could use bioplastics and all kinds of things. There's ways, there's green chemistry, there's different ways we can make our products without destroying the environment. That's what we have to really push for.
I have a question for you, Antonio. Listening to you, and also like about how we use, like in media literacy, how we use media to create something. So we are consumers, we are producers, but the term of like what we call in France like décroissance or degrowth does not pop up right here. So of course, like in ecological studies, you hear about sustainability, about my greening, like plastic or whatever. But thinking about also the term cultures that you use, like I can imagine the culture in Italy is totally different than the United States. We have like different approaches to a certain way of answering questions, like by the state or like maybe more the individual level. So I was wondering what's your stand on that point? You see, like about these kind of degrowth, and have you looked into that?
Yeah. I mean, I go a little bit into that in my book. We really have to look at the economic models. I mean, that's why I put political ecology as one of the analytical lenses, because what is the economic system that justifies this behavior? And it's not just the making of gadgets, but it's also film production. You know, like why does the film production go and like use millions of gallons of water and damage and trash environments and use all these materials for sets and things? So Hollywood's getting better, and they're actually one benefit of computers is that you could build sets digitally that reduces the use of materials. So there, I just wanted to mention that as something that we can see environmentally positive. Um, but however we analyze whatever media we're looking at, to really look at what is the economic model behind that. I always emphasize when I study media, what is the economic philosophy that they're basing their production on. So there are different models. There's like circular or donut economics. I hate that word, but it's a good concept. There's degrowth. I mean, all those things are important. And I think the next research that I want to do is to sort of present these different economic models as something that can be incorporated into how we teach media. But I haven't gotten there because there's so much to do.
Mhm. I think that Pamela, you've done something very interesting. It's called like the Youth Media Diet Project. Do you want to talk about that quickly a little bit? What that entails?
Okay, so you're talking about this old Pamela, not the young Pamela.
No, I'm always talking about you.
I am someone who remembers the Northeast media, the New Mexico Media Literacy Project.
Okay.
Yeah, so I come from the prevention world, and I worked mostly in K through 12 situations as a prevention consultant, you know, working off various grants in substance abuse prevention or dating violence prevention or whatever. And that's how I got to media literacy. And so, you know, for me, it's been a continual seesaw of looking at it on the macro level and looking at it on the micro level. And so I tend to use, I know it seems to activists like you, with a short history, that that uh, in environmentalism, sustainability issues are not mainstream enough. And I agree with you, but they're so much more now. And so I use that more global, you know, thinking globally piece of what do we know about how our planet, our communities, our neighborhoods are being polluted and making things less healthy for everyone. And then I have found that to be a wonderful way to talk then about your own body and your own health and what pollutants might you be putting into your body, and what pollutants might you be putting into your mind, and how can you feed both in a more healthy and sustainable way.
Yeah, good point. And just a quick comment. So the concept of environment has been used among some media people with this idea of information pollution or, you know, mental pollution. And so I want to acknowledge that's been around. And so what we're just doing is adding the other part about the body and the health. Also EMFs. We don't talk about EMFs, but that's a big taboo topic. I'd like to give a chance for other people to chat. I see that Pamela is there. There's Serena.
Serene. Yeah.
Serene. Hi.
In Italian, it would be Serena, yeah. So first of all, I loved reading this introduction, and it makes me very eager to read the rest of the book. It really sits with me in a very personal way, and a lot of things that I've been thinking for a long time about about the idea of a paradigm shift and how we need to be thinking through in a totally different way about being one with our environment, right? I also thought it was really prescient because it comes along with the recent release of the Dasgupta review that talks about the economics of biodiversity. But my question was, in reading through that introduction, you're talking about bringing to the forefront of culture a new term for most people, right? Eco-media, right? And so my question is, what is the general thought from you and also from the group here about the idea of giving new terminology to things? My fear is always when we add or change language, we create it as something that's other or different, and so becomes considered separate or something to think of as different, right? So when we add modifiers, right? A common example would be saying something like a female leader or a woman leader versus just a leader. So in the terms of using, what's the kind of conversation around pushing the idea of new terminology to a general populace as opposed to trying to embed more of the eco-media mindset into what people understand as media? Do you feel like there's an opinion, or do you have an opinion about how people absorb that kind of information and if that changes?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to use the new terminology with like I try not to overwhelm people with new words, because I know that people get confused and they're already used to thinking in a certain way. So I'm more interested in, like, rather than if I'm going to go into like a situation in a classroom where people don't have the background, I'm not going to immediately start using the term eco-media. I'll just use media, but I will also try to get them to talk about the metaphor, what they think the metaphor means, and maybe help them arrive to the idea of eco-media later. But we have these terms that we're using in the culture quite a bit now, like media ecosystem is and media environment, and I find that these words are being abused. Like, I think the idea of like the Facebook ecosystem or the Apple ecosystem, these terms are being used quite a bit in the tech world without really any eco consciousness. So at the same time, when people are using it in a way that I feel like lacks any depth to it, I would like to problematize it. But one of the points I make in my book is that I'm aware that my model is somewhat advanced and complicated because it's interdisciplinary and it's not a linear approach. So I make a suggestion to do a simple version and to not use the new terms, but to use the old terms. Don't use eco-culture, just say culture. Don't say eco-materialism, just talk about materialism or even political ecology. That's more like if you're at it with college students, you can start playing around with that. But if I was with grade school kids or high school kids, I wouldn't introduce those complicated terms. I would just try to keep it as simple as possible. So yeah, I agree that I would, at least at the beginning stages, try to be somewhat simplified with the language. Thank you. Pamela, you have your hand up.
Oh. Hey
Mela.
there.
Hey, ciao.
Hi.
Hola.
So, I was thinking about, we're really at this point still in the awareness stage of understanding, or even by the fact that you're writing this book, right? That we're having this discussion and we're starting to think and come up with like a mindful, it's like almost like a mindfulness model, right? Like mindfulness is very popular right now. So being mindful of not just like how we use, but how we consume. It's the same thing that we're discussing with climate change, right? There are going to be the people at the forefront who are mindful of their water use and, all the different issues. And so it's the same thing with technology, that it's like a whole new, we're at that forefront at this point of still in the awareness model. And so, thinking about like social responsibility, or even having teachers just, or professors, and, I see that there's more of a place for this, like in college than there is, at K through 12. And I think part of that is that you can get political in college, whereas, I'm finding a lot of, it's a way more challenging to do that, at the K through 12. And so I don't know if anybody has any ideas around, we're discussing this eco media literacy and just having an awareness around, how we can work with students at the K through 12 level with a mindfulness perspective, I guess. So it's more of a comment and question for others if, you know, people want to.
Well, just a quick response. I love the idea of mindfulness, and there's a lot of people who advocate mindfulness as the first step towards environmental awareness, because mindfulness is being aware of how you exist in an environment and part of an environment. Your cognition is not just isolated in your brain, but it's all around us. But yeah, you raise a good point, and I'm not in the U.S. and I'm not in the trenches the way you are with public schools. So I appreciate this problem, and I also understand that the fossil fuel industry did a good job of politicizing this, and it shouldn't be political, but it is political. So I'm aware that's the reality. So I don't know if, well, it used to be that this kind of work was done outside of schools, but we don't have after school programs anymore. We don't have alternative programs as far as I'm aware of. A lot of them have been eliminated. So I don't know. I would actually be interested to hear what others have to say about the US context, because yeah, you're right. I'm in a university. I'll have a lot more freedom to explore this stuff. So I don't know how those of you who are really battling it out with your public institutions can address this, especially in this really polarized environment that you're in, which is quite terrifying in my opinion.
If I could just jump in, sorry. I have the same thoughts and concerns for sure. And also I think that young people in K-12 right now are like, they're more willing to talk about this. And then it's like, it's not necessarily as partisan issue for young people like it is for adults. Like, I think that it's the adults that are gonna like raise a concern perhaps, but I don't know, kids just like, at least I'm kind of in a conservative district in Massachusetts. I'm gonna say that quietly. But like I don't know, like the kids are just like more willing to just like, yeah, this is real. This is like, to what extent, like the details, but I really actually feel like, I don't know, like I want to try this with students in my high school and just like let them lead the conversation. Like I feel like the adults in the building would have more of a problem than the kids.
Well, I think one thing you could do is you don't even have to start with the politics. Just take your phone and ask them, how is this made? And take them on a journey. And that journey they'll discover is fraught with all the issues that I raised. But you could do it under the guise of scientific literacy, and I mean there's just so many ways to approach it. But to get them to investigate the very the thing that is so pertinent and relative to their lives on a daily basis. There also is the problem of your school of education being like, this is where you study English, this is where you study science, this is where you study math. And it's not integrated. So that's another problem.
Can I go again, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Whenever we're talking about literacies, whether it's eco-media literacy or digital literacy, social media literacy, I feel like, and I'm a little tired of this narrative, the onus is on the individual or, the family unit or the society unit. Can we somehow take the language and framing that you were talking about a little while ago and sort of pivot the entire exercise to have our corporations and our governments and our larger basically governance structures to kind of do something about it? Because frankly, it is up to the individual to kind of use the phone that you just showed, or maybe, can we just make like a more, I'm rambling a little bit right now, I'm sorry, but make it difficult for us to access, say for instance, technology that uses child labor at the policy level?
Well, these are good points. And that's why I think part of one aspect of eco-media literacy that I talk about in the book is eco-citizenship, that the students have to be have to learn or should learn how to get involved, because, you know, it's how do governments change? I mean, I think that the Fridays for Future movement and the Sunrise movement in the US have put a lot of pressure on politicians to change, but the COVID thing has sort of interrupted that process a little bit because people can't be visible about these issues like they were. But, you know, 2 years ago, there was a demonstration in Rome of just kids. It was like, I want to say 500,000. It was so huge. It was all middle school and grade school, and, you know, just the parents kind of, they dragged us along. But I was so happy, I cried, you know. And Greta Thunberg, she came to Rome, and, you know, I saw the kids, and it was just like amazing what was going on. And, you know, that will help put pressure on the government. I know in India you have this big farmer strike going on, which hopefully will make a difference for some of the issues that they're trying to deal with. But how do you get governments to change? So unfortunately, it does. I said before, it can't always be about the individual, because they're always sort of blaming us, like it's our fault that our ecological footprint individually is creating this mess. With that, with the policies not changing, but at the same time, how do these policies change? It's sort of like a vicious cycle. So we have to put pressure on, and we have to put. But one thing Sam was asking me about my Fairphone. I don't know. I think you can get these in the U.S. now. But this is a company out of Amsterdam that uses. They source their materials from. They don't use conflict minerals. They use good labor practices. They use recycling. When you upgrade a phone, you can send it in. They recycle all the materials, and you can fix it. It's like Legos. You can take it apart, and if something breaks, you can fix that. So it's good also to support companies and organizations that are trying to make a change. And so Fairphone is taken off quite a bit in Europe, and it's a really good. They have a really good vision of the kind of transition we have to go. So one thing I do is, you know, I take my Fairphone to class and I show it to the students and talk about it, and they always get very excited about that. So it's good to show alternatives, so that change is possible. Someone else want to jump in?
I have a question.
Yes.
So inevitably, there's always like sticky points when you're trying to teach something this complex in a classroom. And I'm wondering if you have noticed any points that might be a little bit trickier on a habitual basis that we should be looking for or thinking more about, or any tips that you might have for things that we should expect as we kind of introduce this for the first time.
Well, so one of the problems that's fairly consistent is it's hard to get students to think about the concept of the environment without previous associations. So you want to get them to think of it actually more as a neutral concept. So, for example, if I talk about this idea of environmental ideology, environmental ideology is a spectrum of beliefs. If I throw something on the ground, that's an environmental belief, right? Even if I'm damaging the environment, that's an environmental belief. So they get a little bit confused at times where when you talk, they think that if you use the word environment, it automatically means something good. So it's important for them to understand that there's no singular concept of what the environment is, that it's cultural construct, that there's different beliefs, and that even like McDonald's has an environmental philosophy as does an indigenous person, but they're different types of philosophies. So I think that's important. That seems to be like a kind of a hitch. The other thing I find that is most productive is that to get them to be as aware as possible of how it connects to their own personal lives, so that it's not abstract. And that's why, as an assignment, I have them analyze their gadget. So it's their own gadget. It's the one that they use, and they learn about it. So they have a sort of a personal relationship about the broader issues and how it belongs, and how it's part of their own individual lives. That's what comes off the top of my head. Those are some basic issues that I've had to deal with. I've never had anyone challenge the politics of it. They always come in. I mean, they always get it right away. I've never had like a MAGA person say, "Oh, climate change isn't real." I've never had that problem ever.
No, but Vasuprada raises an interesting point in the chat. She's written this message. It starts with ICT is a development marker.
Uh-huh.
Should I just read it out?
Can you summarize it? Because we only have a few minutes, and what's the main point?
She's talking about digital divides and how eco-media literacy could be like, I mean, opening up on carbon emissions could be like a Pandora's box. Because what is, sustainable for someone might be about survival for someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have to be sensitive to, different, for example, one thing it's important not to do is to assume that all indigenous people have sort of a romantic idea of the environment. There's some indigenous people that depend on mining that damage the environment because of economic reasons or because they have to. So we have to be culturally aware, culturally sensitive. But one thing I'm very keen on, and I talk again a lot about in this book, is the idea of that there's inequalities in the way that environmental damage is done, in that people who are in the so-called developing world, is a term I don't really like, but shouldn't be put on the same burden as people, let's say in Europe or the US, who have disproportionately impacted the environment. Because the United States consumes the equivalent of almost 4 planets in a year. If everyone in the world consumed the way the United States did, we would be consuming 4 planets in a year. That's impossible. So part of the problem is that certain societies income inequality is related to that as well. The income inequality drives a lot of the environmental destruction. So eco-justice is something I'm very keen on, and something I care a lot about. I talk a lot about this in the book, that we have to be sensitive that different cultures, different situations have different approaches and require different solutions, and it's not going to be the same for everybody. I know that's a very oversimplified response to your question, when your question was very good. I'm just afraid that with only 5 minutes, I don't know if we have a chance to get into everyone else's questions.
Yeah, it's true. We only have like 5 minutes left. So maybe we're gonna take like one more question or one more comment, I think. What do you think, Antonio? For wrapping
that
up.
would be fine. Yeah, and I apologize. I mean, not apologize, but it's a big topic that there's so much to cover that it's very difficult to do in 1 hour. So, but I'm so excited because all you guys are great thinking about this in really good ways, enjoyable ways. There's some comments here. Any other comments or questions?
I'll just jump in and say that I've been so inspired by your work, and you know this, Antonio, but when you released Greening Media Education back in 2014, there was so much that clicked into place for my class, because I think some students today, at least in my context, I teach a college level media literacy class, they find themselves to be familiar with issues of bias, with issues of validity and disinformation, with issues of representation. And so even in a class like mine, sometimes I felt like they were missing a crucial piece of the interconnectedness of all of these issues. And I feel like eco-media literacy, particularly your work in that text, and I haven't read the new text yet, it really pulls together how the economics are interconnected with representation, are interconnected with the advertising and the persuasive components of what we think we need to measure up in these cultural spaces where ideology kind of underlies our action and behavior. And so I think I'm just so excited, and thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Teresa. Teresa's doing great work in her classes. Maybe can you talk for 1 minute how you do this role-playing project with your class?
Sure, I'll be very brief. One of the strategies that I use in class is participatory culture strategies and constructivist education, where students are situated as having active knowledge on any topic. And I want to craft opportunities for them to bring that knowledge to the conversation. So I was so inspired by Antonio's work, but I was puzzled about how to teach in a way that put students in the driver's seat. So I found Tim Swinehart and Bigelow's work, A People's Curriculum for the Earth, where they have a role-play scenario for issues related to the climate crisis. And these are standard issues related to the climate crisis that you might stereotypically think of, like, contaminated water, for instance. But what I did is I crafted scenarios related to conflict mineral mining in the Congo, e-waste in Ghana and China, cloud storage based on a fabricated scenario that I created in Brazil, where a river was being dammed to create hydropower to power the cloud. That's based off a book called Last Flight of the Scarlet Macaw, so it's kind of an imagined scenario. And then I use one of the scenarios from Bigelow and Swinehart. But essentially, students need to role play that they participate in those spaces, in those communities, and then ultimately they're led into a problem-solving phase where they need to generate the policy or the solutions. And they've come up with everything from your phones needing like a big sticker on them, like tobacco had to eventually do on cigarettes, that builds awareness for where those materials are coming from and where they're going to go, to things like creating phones out of like barley-based plastics. I mean, they come up with wild stuff, but the idea is they're in the driver's seat and they need to generate those solutions. A lot of it has to do with government policy, though, as was discussed in the chat here.
Mm-hmm.
But again, wouldn't have been possible without Antonio sparking that excitement.
But the wild thing, these are good things, right? So I can imagine. So I think, Antonio, we should wrap up, except if somebody really wants to speak up one more time. Otherwise, I think maybe Samantha, do we need to announce something for next time before I say thank you, first of all, Antonio? Thank you very much.
One quick announcement.
Yeah.
So I'm developing a website with resources that anyone can use, with videos, and it's going to be a long project, so I'm just doing it by myself. But as the beta version comes out, I'll share it with Sam and Michael. They can pass it along to you guys, and I welcome input and responses and support. So, because I'm trying to get this out into the world as fast as possible. So anyways, I just want to put that out there.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the comments and the lively discussion, of course. So I think much appreciated. I think the more we discuss, the better it is, I think. And then I want to hand it over to Samantha, maybe about the next Media Club, right?
Yeah, first, thank you so much, Antonio, and thanks to everybody for such a great discussion on such an important topic that we haven't ever talked about before in 3 years. So that really speaks to the importance of talking more about this and getting that work out there. So Antonio, if you will send us your slides that you promised to all of us, that would be great, and I'll send them out to the group. And next time, we're actually talking about another topic that we surprisingly haven't talked about yet, which is social emotional learning. So I put the link to our website, where you can find more information about the next book, which is Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. So thank you guys again. Hope to see you next week, and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was great. I really appreciate it. Bye, everyone. Nice to see you all. Some of your familiar faces too.
Stay safe. Nice to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Thanks, Michael.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.
See you later.